Hi, you are listening to Listen and Relax. And that is exactly our aim. This is a brand new channel, and you're listening to our first stories. These are true stories, and they are completely ad free. If you want us to continue making these videos, please let us know in the comments what you think about the stories and if we should continue. Please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated when we post new exciting stories. The Holocaust Denier. Have you ever gone on a date that was so bad you just had to get up and leave? I'm talking about the kind of date where you're sitting across from someone and you're thinking, what am I even doing here? Like you can literally feel your soul starting to die a little bit with every word they say. Yeah, I've been there. Let me take you through two wild dates I went on where I definitely should have walked out sooner, but thankfully, I finally did. So, here's the first one. I was a widow at the time, and I was dipping my toes into the world of online dating. I know, not ideal, right? But hey, I thought, why not? Life is short. I matched with this guy who seemed decent enough, good conversation, smart, seemed to have a decent sense of humor. So we decide to meet up for lunch at a little restaurant nearby. We start talking, and he mentions he'd just come back from a month-long trip to Germany. I'm immediately interested because, hey, I've never been and I've always wanted to see it. So, of course, I asked him about the trip. Did you visit any of the concentration camps? I ask, thinking it's a pretty innocent question. I've always had a soft spot for history. And after all, it's something that's a huge part of world history. And it's something I care deeply about. Well, that was a mistake. He slams his hand on the table like he's just been triggered by something major. They were work camps, not concentration camps, he practically yells. There was no killing. People just worked there. I literally blinked at him. What the actual hell? Trying to stay calm, I said, well, what about Auschwitz? Just trying to steer the conversation in a direction where maybe, he'd realize how wrong he was. But nope, that was not the way to go. He straight up loses it. There was no Holocaust. All those stories about the death camps, they're just Jews looking for sympathy. I know several people who survived those work camps, and they'll tell you the same thing. It's all exaggerated. At this point, I'm absolutely stunned. I mean, I was married to a Jewish man. I knew exactly what happened. I'd seen the photos. I'd heard the stories. I knew better. And this guy, he's out here spouting this nonsense like it's the truth. I could feel my blood pressure rising, and my stomach was doing flips. I was horrified, honestly. But here's the kicker. I wasn't about to sit there and argue with this guy over history, not when he was that far gone. So I did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. I grabbed my purse, plopped down the money for the meal that hadn't even arrived yet, thankfully, and I got up. I don't think he even noticed. He was too busy ranting about how the Holocaust was a myth. I walked right past him, and as I was leaving, I hear this random guy at another table start clapping. He gives me this huge wink, like, good for you, girl. I just smiled back because, honestly, I had dodged a bullet that day. I didn't even care about the meal at that point. That was not the kind of person I needed to be spending time with. The world has enough hate in it. I wasn't about to tolerate anymore. She had dodged a bullet. The arrogant, sexist jerk. So, this day was actually set up by my boss. Big mistake, right? I mean, my boss meant well, but he clearly didn't know what kind of man would be a good fit for me. I was skeptical, but I agreed to go. It was a blind date, and we met at a nice restaurant. From the second I sat down, I just knew something was wrong. He didn't even greet me properly. No, hey, nice to meet you. Or, how's your day going? No, the first thing he said to me was, nice boobs. Like what? I mean, seriously. I couldn't believe it. I was literally sitting there, thinking, did he just say that? But I tried to stay cool, right? I'm not one to make a scene. But it wasn't just that comment. Oh no, it was everything. The whole vibe of the date was just off. He was arrogant, loud, and completely oblivious to how disrespectful he was being. He started bragging about his salary, his fancy car, and then, this is the best part, he starts making sexual comments to the server. Not even subtle ones. Like inappropriate comments that were so gross, I could feel myself shrinking in my chair. It was like I was stuck in a bad episode of a reality show where everyone's just awful, and I couldn't change the channel. And then, to top it all off, he said, and I quote, I bet you'll be coming back to my place later tonight. He said it loud enough for the couple next to us to hear. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment. He had no idea how to act in public, let alone on a date. At that point, I was done. But here's the thing, I was going to make this date cost him. I was going to make him regret ever saying a word to me. I waited until he was talking about himself again, and I just smiled. I excused myself to the bathroom, but instead of going to the bathroom, I walked straight out the back door. Yep, just like that. I was out of there. I didn't even look back. I could almost hear his voice trailing off as I walked away. But you know what? I didn't care. 15 minutes later, I was at home, sipping a glass of wine, watching Netflix, and eating a bowl of cheesy popcorn. No regrets. But the best part, the next day, I went back to the restaurant to make sure the sweet server who had been harassed by him got a good tip. As I'm handing her the cash, she tells me what happened after I left. Apparently, my date had thrown a full-blown tantrum. He yelled, broke his chair, and scared the crap out of the staff. I just smiled to myself. Karma was working overtime that night. So, yeah. Sometimes the only way to escape a horrible date is to just get up and leave. Because honestly, karma is priceless. You can't put a price on the satisfaction of knowing that Jerk's bad behavior came back to bite him. And by the way, my boss, he never said a word about the date. Not a single mention. He probably figured it was best to just let that one slide. But honestly, I'm glad I walked out. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Story 3. No jail time for me. So I was on Tinder one day, swiping through profiles, just casually seeing who was out there. And I matched with this girl who seemed pretty cool at first glance. But her photos, well, let's just say they raised a few questions. She looked a lot younger than her bio suggested, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was maybe using older photos. I mean, I look younger than my age too, so I thought maybe she was like me, just someone who doesn't seem to age much. I figured it was worth meeting her in person to find out. We start talking, and after a few exchanges, I suggested we meet up for coffee. It's usually my go-to first date because it's low pressure, and I find it a good way to get to know someone. So we set up a time and place, Starbucks in downtown, and I got there a little early, ordered my coffee, and sat down to wait. She walks in, and as soon as I see her, something just doesn't feel right. I mean, I know it sounds bad, but she looked even younger in person. Her voice was a bit high-pitched, too. Something was off. I figured it was time to confront her about it, so I said, "You're not as old as you stated in your bio, are you?" And she just admitted it right there. She wasn't just a little younger. She was significantly younger. She was much younger. And then she drops this bombshell. She was into daddy types. I'll admit, I was shocked. Not only did she lie about her age, but the entire situation was just unsettling. I didn't know what to say, but I knew I didn't want to sit through any more of this conversation. So I got up, grabbed my coffee, and said, "Well, I think I'll just head out." I didn't even wait for her to say anything else. I walked out without a second thought. I didn't want to get into a debate or make a scene. I just needed to leave. I'm all for giving people a chance, but that was a no-go for me. No time to waste with this. Now, let me tell you about another date that didn't work out. And honestly, this one was a little different, but just as frustrating. So I make it pretty clear to people that when we're on a date, I expect us to have a genuine conversation. I think it's a basic courtesy to get to know each other, to talk, to share our thoughts and ideas. I don't expect a deep philosophical conversation, but just some back and forth. To make that point clear, I always put my phone face down on the table during a date. It's my way of saying, you have my full attention. Of course, I understand that people might glance at their phone occasionally, but if you're sitting there texting and scrolling through your messages the entire time, that's a problem. So I'm on this date with a woman at a nice restaurant. Things are going fine at first. We're talking, and I'm genuinely interested in what she has to say. But then, just a few minutes into the date, she pulls out her phone. I try not to overthink it at first, but then she starts texting, and not just a quick message. She's fully engaged in her phone, sending messages back and forth, completely ignoring me. I kept trying to keep the conversation going, but it was clear she wasn't paying attention to anything I said. I could tell she wasn't interested in getting to know me. At that point, I had to make a decision. I'm not one to sit through a meal where I'm just being ignored. So I stood up, paid for my half of the meal, and walked out. You want to know the worst part? She didn't even notice. I guess she thought I had just gone to the bathroom or something because when I left, I didn't hear a peep from her. About 20 minutes later, I get a message from her. The first message said, "Where did you go?" And the second one was a lot less polite. She was angry that I had left without saying anything. Honestly, I wasn't mad at her. I was just disappointed. But at the end of the day, I wasn't going to waste my time sitting there with someone who wasn't willing to put down their phone for a simple conversation. Story 5. How I learned not to trust my mom's matchmaking. I have a confession to make. There was a time when yes, my mom used to set me up on blind dates. And let me tell you, it was the absolute worst. I know some people get lucky with these things, but for me, it was like being thrown into the lion's den every time. But the story I'm about to tell you, that's the one that made me swear off blind dates forever. It all started when my mom insisted that I meet this guy she found. Now, I'm not someone who just goes on blind dates for fun, and I definitely wasn't interested in this particular one. But you know how moms are, right? She kept pushing, saying things like, "You never know, he might be great for you." Well, I wasn't convinced, but after weeks of hearing about this guy, I finally gave in. I texted him, we made plans, and decided to meet at a popular local restaurant. It was known for having some of the best pizza in town, and I thought at least I could enjoy a good meal out of the whole thing, right? We agreed on the time, and I showed up a little early, like I always do. I settled into the booth, scrolling through my phone, trying to mentally prepare myself for whatever was about to unfold. And then he walked in. He wasn't bad looking, maybe not exactly my type, but he wasn't a complete disaster. But from the second he sat down, I could feel the red flags waving in the distance. Now, I'm not someone who is overly sensitive, but the first thing he says to me, he makes a joke about my weight. And I mean a joke about my weight. I'm 5 feet 5 inches, and at the time, I weighed about 138 pounds. Not too skinny, but definitely not overweight. I'm not the kind of person to be self-conscious about my body, but when a guy immediately starts making comments about your appearance, especially something as personal as your weight, it's not funny. It's rude, and it's definitely not a joke. It was one of those moments where your brain just short circuits. Like, did that really just happen? But I didn't want to make a scene, so I just laughed it off and decided to move on. Strike one, right? But I let it slide. I thought, okay, maybe he was just trying to be funny. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I didn't want to bail immediately, mostly because it was pouring rain outside and my pizza had already been ordered. So I stuck around. But I'll tell you this, the next hour felt like a century. He started talking about himself, and let me tell you, it was a lot about him. And I'm not talking about interesting stuff, like his hobbies or what he was passionate about. No, it was all about his money. He told me how much money he made, how his boss and colleagues were constantly in awe of him, how he made more money than any of his friends, how he was so tired of women chasing him just because he had money. At that point, I couldn't even believe I was still sitting there trying to be polite. The guy was practically bragging about his salary and his career, and it was just so exhausting. I kept wondering if he even noticed I was sitting across from him. Was I even a person to him? Or was I just another listening ear for his self-congratulatory monologue? He wasn't asking about me, not once. Not even as, "So, what do you do?" or "Tell me more about you." It was just him. Non-stop him. And then the moment I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. He started telling me about his childhood. And I thought, okay, maybe here's where things get a little more personal. Maybe we'll connect on something real. But no, this is where things really started to spiral. He told me how much he hated dogs when he was a kid. He even said that he used to chase them around with a stick. I froze. I love dogs, like I adore them. And hearing someone say that just made my skin crawl. But I stayed quiet. I didn't want to make a scene, so I just kept my mouth shut. But he didn't stop there. Oh no. He saw my silence as approval because then he casually mentioned how, when he was older, he ran over a dog on the highway. I couldn't believe my ears. I just stared at him, wide-eyed, my mind racing. Was he serious? Did he just say that? I managed to blurt out, "Is that for real? Is the dog okay?" And his response? He shrugged as if this was the most normal thing in the world and said, "Who cares about the dog?" I was more worried about my damn car. That was it. I was done. I didn't even know how to respond. There was nothing I could say. It was the most heartless thing I had ever heard in my life. So I did what any sane person would do in that situation. I called the waiter over, asked for the check, and said I wanted to split the bill. I paid my half, stood up, and walked out without saying another word to him. As I left, I could hear him behind me, probably still talking about himself, oblivious of the fact that I had just completely checked out mentally and physically. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I stepped outside into the rain. It was like I had just escaped a terrible nightmare. But the story didn't end there. Of course, he texted me later, complaining about how I had overreacted. He told me it was my fault for getting upset. He said I was being too sensitive. I didn't even bother to argue with him. He was clearly a narcissist, and engaging with that level of entitlement was pointless. So I did what any person with some self respect would do. I blocked him. I never wanted to hear from him again. And here's the kicker. After that disaster of a date, my mom, bless her heart, finally stopped setting me up with random guys. I think that date was so bad. Even she couldn't deny that matchmaking wasn't her strongest suit. The date that went horribly wrong, and how I got the last laugh. Let me tell you about the time I had one of the most bizarre, humiliating, and ultimately empowering experiences on an online date. This was a few years ago, and I'll be honest, it still makes for a great story. I had met this guy online, and right off the bat, I could tell we had a decent connection. His profile seemed promising, and I wasn't expecting anything dramatic. I'll admit, I don't like to overthink these things, so I'm upfront about who I am. I don't believe in hiding behind old or edited photos, and I don't believe in presenting myself in any way other than exactly how I look. I wasn't about to post a selfie with a high angle shot to hide any imperfections or post a picture from 10 years ago just to get a date. No, what you see is what you get. This guy had seen my pictures, top to bottom. We had exchanged a few messages, and when he asked me out, I was genuinely excited. He picked the restaurant, a nice little spot with a cozy vibe, and it sounded great. He seemed like a decent guy. I mean, he knew exactly what I looked like, so there shouldn't have been any surprises, right? When I arrived, he was already waiting at the table. He stood up, smiled, and gave me a handshake. Everything seemed normal, like any other first date. We ordered drinks, and everything was going fine at first. We were talking about casual things, work, hobbies, our general likes and dislikes. But then, out of nowhere, the conversation took a sharp left turn. He took a long sip of his drink, set it down with a little too much force, and then leaned in a little too closely. And then, with a straight face, he asked me, "Have you ever thought about losing weight? I bet you'd be real pretty if you were skinnier." I swear, time stopped for a moment. The words hung in the air, like some kind of bad punchline to a joke that wasn't even funny. I think my brain actually short-circuited for a second as I processed what he had just said. Was he serious? I mean, I've heard all kinds of things in my time, but nothing like this. The audacity, the sheer arrogance to say something like that to someone you just met, knowing full well that they'd been upfront with you about their appearance. This wasn't just rude, it was cruel. Now, I know some people might have stayed and tried to explain why the comment was out of line, or maybe even tried to salvage the evening with some kind of polite response. But that's just not my style. I'm not the type of person to waste my time on someone who doesn't respect me. So without missing a beat, I stood up, pushed my chair back, and told him, "Well, I think the date's over." No dramatics, no shouting, just a simple statement of fact. I was done. I got up from the table and walked straight to the waitress. I didn't even glance back at him. I told her exactly what had happened, how he made a completely inappropriate comment, and how I wouldn't be staying. I asked her to bring my meal and my drink to the bar and to go ahead and close out my portion of the tab. Now, I've been around long enough to know that when someone shows their true colors like that, you don't stick around. I wasn't about to let this guy waste any more of my time. So I made my way to the bar, ordered another drink, and settled in to relax. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. I hadn't been sitting there for more than 10 minutes when I noticed a familiar figure standing in front of me. Yes, it was him, the guy who had just insulted me. And now he had the nerve to ask me for a ride home. He looked at me with a sheepish smile, as if nothing had happened, and said, "Hey, I forgot my wallet at home. Could you give me a ride? I'll pay you back as soon as I get my wallet." I just stared at him. I mean, really? Was he so deluded that he thought after insulting me so blatantly, I would then offer him a favor? What was going through his mind? I didn't even flinch. I calmly took a sip of my drink and said, "You're better off calling a friend for a ride. And don't forget your wallet next time." I made it very clear that I was not about to help him out. I didn't offer any sympathy or excuses. I stood up, grabbed my to go box from the bartender, and gave him one last glance before I walked out of the restaurant. He was left standing there looking confused, maybe even a little embarrassed. He'd been left to sort out his own mess. The last thing I saw was him turning to the bouncer, trying to explain himself. The bouncer didn't look impressed. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt this sense of satisfaction wash over me. Not only had I stood up for myself, but I had also gotten the last word in. This guy had walked into that restaurant thinking he could make some snide comment and get away with it. But I wasn't having any of it. I wasn't going to let him belittle me, or anyone else for that matter. In the weeks that followed, I laughed about the whole situation. It became a funny story to share with friends, something I could look back on with a smirk. Online dating can be a minefield, but I've learned to take the absurdities in stride. In the end, I never heard from him again. No surprise there. And I certainly didn't waste any more of my time on someone who couldn't see past the surface. The whole experience also helped me refine my approach to online dating. These days, I refuse to chat for weeks on and with someone who isn't willing to meet up within 48 hours. I'm not interested in wasting my time with scammers or catfishers. I'm straightforward and I make it clear from the start that I want to meet in person sooner rather than later. If they're serious, they'll follow through. If not, then they're not worth my time. As for that guy, well, he didn't make the cut. But I learned something valuable that night. It's never too late to stand up for yourself, and it's always worth it to walk away from someone who doesn't deserve your time or respect. The Tinder date that turned into a free meal and a big lesson. It all started with a simple swipe right on Tinder. It was December, and I was doing the usual, scrolling through profiles when I came across his. We started chatting, and for a while, things seemed all right. Nothing too exciting, but we were talking pretty regularly. I'd been in the middle of a career change, and with the holiday season rolling around, I was also planning a trip to my hometown to celebrate my birthday with family. We had made plans to meet during New Year's, but I ended up having to cancel. I explained it to him and apologized for the change in plans. No big deal, right? At least that's what I thought. We kept chatting on WhatsApp in the meantime. I mentioned my birthday had passed a few weeks ago, and that was when things took a turn. He made a strange request. He asked if I could treat him to dinner at a fancy little place and kept insisting, "Don't worry, I won't bring my wallet. You can pay." Now, I don't mind picking up the check every once in a while, but something about the way he kept phrasing it rubbed me the wrong way. Yet I thought maybe I was overthinking things, so I agreed. I figured, whatever, it'll be a nice dinner out. Fast forward to the day of the date. We were supposed to meet at 8 p.m., but of course he was running late. A lot of people are, right? But 40 minutes late? No text, no apology, just a "hey, I'm here now." As soon as he arrived, I could tell he wasn't in a rush to make up for lost time. He barely even acknowledged me. He just sat down, ordered his food, and immediately glued his eyes to his phone. Now, I get it, life happens, people get busy, and he's in digital marketing, just like me. Maybe there was some kind of urgent work thing happening. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I let it slide. He was texting away, and I gave him the benefit of the doubt, thinking he was just wrapped up in work. The food came, and he continued texting. I sat there, picking at my own meal, silently fuming but not wanting to make a scene. I figured I'd wait it out and see if the situation improved. But it didn't. Another 20 minutes passed. He was still eating, still texting, and barely acknowledging my presence. At this point, I was getting really annoyed. I wanted to leave, but I also wanted to know where this was going. So I decided to step away for a bit. I told him I needed to take a call, and as I stood up to walk away, I couldn't help but glance at his phone screen as he continued to text. And then I saw it. The conversation. I wasn't trying to snoop, but I couldn't help myself. He was texting someone, a woman, and from the tone of the messages, it was clear she was not just a friend. He was telling her he was at the office, which clearly he was not, and she was sending him some very, very casual pictures of herself. I watched him respond with those tongue emojis and those lit emojis, totally ignoring me at the table. Seriously? I thought, this guy is here for a free meal. I was done. I was over it. I took a deep breath, tried to keep my cool, and walked back to the table with a smile plastered on my face. I slid my wallet into my back pocket, stood up and said, "I just got a call. I'll be right back." He didn't even look up. I walked straight to the bar, ordered an Uber, and waited for it to arrive. He was still busy texting, probably oblivious to the fact that I was already halfway out the door. When the Uber pulled up, I paid my share of the meal to the waiter. The bill was around 1,200 Indian rupees, but I left 500 Indian rupees under the salt and pepper shaker. I thought it was only fair. After all, I had agreed to pay for my portion, and I wasn't going to let him walk away without being responsible for his part. But I wasn't about to sit there and get played like some fool. As I stepped into the cab, I couldn't help but feel a little smug. I had caught him red-handed, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. About 10 minutes into my ride, my phone buzzed. It was a message from him. He asked, "Where are you?" The waiter is asking for the bill. I had a few seconds to process the question, and then I replied with the most casual response I could muster. "My share is next to my plate. You'll find it by the salt and pepper." And then I did something that felt oddly satisfying. I blocked him. The next 20 minutes were blissfully quiet. My phone buzzed with missed calls, 13 of them, to be exact. He had been calling over and over again, but I wasn't answering. All those calls went straight to auto reject. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the last time I ever heard from him. To be honest, I found it kind of funny in the end. It was almost like a reverse of those stories you hear about girls asking guys to recharge their phones or do some other ridiculous thing just to make them feel needed. This guy had tried to play me, thinking he could get a free meal and walk away unscathed, but instead, he got nothing, except maybe a bruised ego. That night, I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel betrayed or embarrassed. I just felt free. I had stood up for myself, handled the situation with grace and a bit of humor, and walked away knowing I wouldn't waste my time on someone who didn't respect me. And that, my friends, is how you turn a bad date into a lesson learned.